It was coming upon Christmas, and little Sammy asked his mom if he could have a new bike for Christmas. So she told him the best idea would be for him to go up to his room and write a letter to Santa asking for it. But Sammy had just played an integral role in the school nativity play, and so he thought it'd be better to ask Jesus instead. So he sat down to write a letter, and he said, "Dear Jesus, I've been a very good boy this year, and I would like to have a bike for Christmas." Well, as he reread the letter he'd written, he thought about it, and he thought, well, okay, let me be a little more honest. And so then he wrote this, "Dear Jesus, I'm a good boy most of the time, and I would like to have a bike for Christmas." Well, as he reflected on that and read over it again, he thought, well, I'm not happy with this. Let me be a little more honest. And so he wrote a third time, "Dear Jesus, I could be a good boy if I tried really hard, and it would help if I had a new bike for Christmas." He read that and thought he still wasn't satisfied, so he decided to go for a little walk around the block just to kind of clear his head and to think about it. And as he was walking, he walked by a house that had a little statue of Mary, the Virgin, in a garden. And so he went into the yard, grabbed the statue, stuck it under his jacket, went up to his room and hid it under his bed and wrote his final letter. He said, "Dear Jesus, if you ever want to see your mother again, I better get a new bike for Christmas." There are 4 accounts that we have of the life of Jesus, and we know them as the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're similar to each other, but they each have a unique way of presenting Jesus to the reader, depending on who the Gospel was being written to. So Mark and John, they don't say anything about Jesus' birth. Instead, they both begin by telling us about John the Baptist, who was Jesus' relative, probably a cousin. Matthew and Luke both tell us about Jesus' birth and the events surrounding it, but their stories, what they tell us, are very different. Luke also begins with the story of John the Baptist, but starts with John's parents, Zechariah and Elizabeth. Now, why would 3 of the 4 Gospels about Jesus start with John the Baptist? This is because Mark gives us the answer. This is because not only was the coming Messiah prophesied about, but there was also prophecy saying that someone would come before the Messiah to tell the people the Messiah was coming. A herald, someone to say, the Messiah is coming, and people thought that actually that was going to be Elijah that would come back and do that. And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Jesus said that John is, in fact, the Elijah that was prophesied. So Malachi wrote, "I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way." Isaiah wrote, "A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him." So Mark and Luke and John, they all start their letters, their gospel, by telling the readers that these prophecies have been fulfilled through John the Baptist. Matthew is unique from the other 3 Gospels, and that Matthew starts his writing not with an engaging story to draw us in, right? But instead he starts with a genealogy. And in the genealogy, we read, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Abijah the father of Asa, Asa the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Jehoram. Now, how boring is that, right? That's not exciting. There's no hook there to draw the reader in, right? If you see a movie or you read an exciting book, there's usually something right up front that gets you drawn in. Now, for us, we read the list of names, and I had actually thought about reading the entire genealogy, but then I thought, okay, that's too boring even for me to sit through. But for the Jews, and Matthew wrote his letter to the Jews, that was not boring at all. In fact, the Jews, they were expecting the Messiah to be born from the line of David. So this was very important to them. This would be a question that his Jewish readers that read his gospel were asking. Well, okay, is this Jesus? Is he from the line of David? This has been one of the first questions that they would have asked. And Matthew knew this. So he starts out his birth narrative, his story about the Messiah, with these words. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So Matthew not only connects Jesus with David, but also reminds them that Jesus is also a descendant of Abraham. Now, Matthew also does something very interesting with this genealogy. And for us today in our culture, in this day and age, we don't even notice it. We just read by it and it's just the way it is. No big deal. But he did something that was unheard of at that time. In his genealogy, he lists 4 women. And in a male-dominated society, this was very unusual. Very few people cared about women back then, and especially not enough to mention them in an important written genealogy for an important person. But not only were there women in the genealogy, but these women had sketchy pasts. Right? Rahab was a prostitute and a foreigner. She lived in Jericho during the time when Joshua they had spies come in to see if they were going to come and take this land, the promised land God had promised them. And Rahab had hid these spies, so she was a traitor to her own people. Not only was she a foreigner and a woman, she was a traitor. But she hid these spies and then let them down the wall, outer wall, in a basket at night. And so they had told her, if you just put this scarf out your window, when we come to take the city, we'll save you and your family. And they did. And she ended up marrying a man and in the line of King David. So, actually David wasn't there yet, but they were in that lineage. And so Matthew lists her. So the pious Jews detested prostitutes and even sometimes stoned them to death. But she's there in the story. Ruth is also listed there. Now Ruth, this is a good story, and we have a whole book in our Old Testament called the Book of Ruth. But Ruth, she wasn't Jewish either. She also was a foreigner. So now we got 2 foreigners in there. Jesus is related to David, but he's not even a pure blood, right? He's of mixed race. So here's this Messiah that was expected, and Matthew makes a point of saying this Messiah, yes, he's in the line of David, here's his genealogy, but he's not even a pure blood. Women, foreigners, prostitutes. So the pious Jews detested people who were of mixed race, but they still thought of themselves as Jews and children of Abraham. This is why the story of the Good Samaritan would have been so shocking to the Jews who heard it, right? Verse 6, what about this woman? Her name isn't even mentioned. In verse 6, we're told, David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Matthew doesn't even list her by name. Everyone knew it. They knew what her name was. You know it. It is, Bathsheba. 2,000 years later, we still know her name. And yet, Matthew doesn't write it down. Instead, he accentuates the fact that David was there with another man's wife. You know the story. David was up and saw her taking a bath on a rooftop, and so he went and called and had her brought to him, and he slept with her, even though she was the wife of a soldier that was serving him. And then when she got pregnant, when David found out, he had Uriah, her husband, killed, and brought her in as his own wife. So they knew it. They would have known exactly who she was talking about. So if you were writing a biography about someone and you wanted people to like that person, especially Jewish people a couple thousand years ago, why would you put women in the biography, especially foreigners, knowing that this would be a turnoff, knowing that the Jewish religious men that read this would be turned off by that? You wouldn't. That's it. You wouldn't do that. But Matthew spent 3 years with Jesus. Matthew heard Jesus teach. Matthew saw Jesus die, and then Matthew saw Jesus after he was raised from the dead. See, Matthew knew why Jesus came. And Matthew knew that all of these women, with their questionable past, They were not only part of the story, they were the point of the story. Matthew knew that sin was the reason why Jesus came in the first place. Matthew wanted the people to know that this really is a story about light coming into darkness. That this is really a story about God's grace penetrating the boundaries set up by the law. That this really is a story about forgiveness in a world that knew only condemnation. The other thing that Matthew knew, though, was that this was also his story. You see, Matthew was a tax collector, the lowest of the low. You had sinners, then you had prostitutes, and then you had tax collectors. And yet, Jesus called Matthew, the lowest of the low, to come and be his disciple. And we can imagine what the other disciples were thinking when Jesus called this tax collector to come and be one of his disciples. And now these are rough men, fishermen, and different past each of these guys, and yet they weren't a tax collector. And so we can only imagine what they thought when they saw this tax collector now being one of Jesus' disciples too. What about you? What are your thoughts when you see someone that you consider a sinner? We know we're all sinners, but they're a worse sinner than you. What do you think when you see them? What thoughts go through your mind? Someone who's different than you. They don't act the way you think a Christian should. But isn't it true, if we're honest with ourselves, isn't it true that oftentimes when we start judging them, we never even make it to the sin, do we? Look at how they're dressed. Listen to the way they're talking. Look at how their kids act, right? All the things we start judging these people, we hardly ever make it to their sin. How do you see and think about the people you consider sinners? Or at least worse sinners than you? You might think that there is no way God will ever forgive you. But then you kind of compare yourself to someone else and you think, oh, I'm in for sure, right? Here's the good news, though, of the gospel. Sinners are not just a part of Jesus' story and the Christmas story. Sinners are the point of the Christmas story. We see signs everywhere that say Jesus is the reason for the season. And it is his birth that we celebrate during Advent and at Christmas. But it is because of our sin, because of your sin, and because of my sin that Jesus had to come in the first place. It's because none of us are perfect. All of us have fallen short of the glory of God. It's because all of us are in need of God's grace and forgiveness. It's because of your sin and my sin that Jesus came. So, the next time you hear someone say, Jesus is the reason for the season, you can say, well, actually, I'm the reason for the season. Or if you're mad at that person, you can say, you're the reason for the season. Please pray with me. Father, you're so good to us. While we were yet sinners, you sent your own Son down to die on the cross for us. So this week and this Advent season, as we head towards Christmas, we do celebrate the birth of your Son, this incredible gift of love and grace that you have given us. But Father, would you also, while we're celebrating, would you help us to see others around us the way that you see them? Would you help us to see them with eyes of grace and mercy instead of condemnation? We ask this, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to have a time now where we can celebrate